How about telling me some people or places, events that you feel have really inspired and influenced your journey?
Sure. That's a big place to start. Maybe I'll just start with um, my own narrative a little bit
Sure.
in terms of some of the first things I became involved in as an activist were here in Maine. I'm not from Maine. I moved here about 8 years ago in my early 20s. And I was really looking for a way to become a political person. I sort of, knew that activism was a thing and people were doing it around me, but I was looking for that access point, that place where I could get involved. And so some of the first work I did was getting involved in direct action campaigns. In Maine, I got involved with some folks that were working on the Moosehead Lake campaign, which was a campaign to stop development of Moosehead Lake, and just generally wilderness defense stuff in Maine. We're living in the largest continuous forest east of the Mississippi River, and so Maine Earth First and Native Forest Network and folks that were doing defense work around that. And from there, it was very direct action oriented and sort of responding to development projects and stuff like that. And I was interested in learning more or moving more towards a grassroots organizing perspective, or I had this sense that that we were on the defensive a lot, and I was interested in getting a bigger picture or thinking more about how we could be on the offensive, or how do we get to some more fundamental political questions so that we're not just trying to protect things once they're already at risk, but try to fundamentally shift power somehow. I don't know that I articulated it in that way at the time, but I think those are some of the things I was wrestling with. And I started getting very much into grassroots media. So I did that for a while, where I was very much into the importance of telling our stories as a political movement. And then from there, I was organized into what is still, I would say, my political home, which is with the Southern Maine Workers Center. And we're very much a grassroots organization, and working on social and economic and racial justice issues, and primarily focusing on organizing low-wage workers in Southern Maine. Yeah.
So are there particular individuals who have influenced you in some of this work, or have there been communities that...
Sure, yeah. Well, so I was organized into the Workers Center by my dear friend Drew Joy, who is actually from Maine but left Maine as a young person, and learned from organizers in places like Philadelphia and New Orleans and Oakland, the Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland, and California, working with organizers of color and people doing social and racial justice and economic justice work, and through decades of learning with people, brought what they knew back home to Maine, and sort of brought all these relationships that they had built across the country back to Maine, and wanted to connect people in Maine to those movements that were happening in other places and in bigger cities. And so I have learned so much from them about what it means to be a white person in a majority white state, that's talking about issues of economic justice, and understanding that even in spaces where there's mostly white people or majority white organizing spaces, we have to be making race and racism central to our conversation always, because it's such a fundamental part of what has divided social movements. I mean, it's a fundamental aspect of what created the world that we live in today. Racism is fundamental to the American experience. So that's something I would say I've been learning the past couple of years, and that I've learned specifically through my relationships with Drew and other people that I've met at the Workers Center.
Great. I know you've been very involved with some of the issues with the Wabanaki people here in Maine. How has that come about?
Sure. Well, I've been transcribing for the Wabanaki Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and striving to be in solidarity with some of the things that, Wabanaki people are organizing around in Maine, like, their fight to maintain their sovereignty rights over the Penobscot River, but mostly peripherally. Mostly it's something just that I think it's really important to be aware of, and to strive to be in solidarity with them. So I've been trying to stay aware of their work and build relationships where I can.
Where do you think the passion and creative spirit that seems to be very evident in the climate justice movement today, and particularly among youth, where's that coming from? Do you have a sense?
I think that, so I'm actually studying this as a student. I'm also a student at the University of Southern Maine, and I've been involved in student organizing around public higher education, but I'm very interested in the history of the environmental justice movement, and I think that's sort of the roots of where the term climate justice comes from. So there's a deep and rich history of people of color organizing in the United States to raise awareness around and name the fact that environmental racism is a problem, the fact that people of color are far more likely to live near toxic industries, toxic waste sites, and that race is the most defining factor in terms of the thing that's most likely to determine whether you're going to live in a polluted area, even more so than class, although class is a major factor. So there's this movement, the environmental justice movement, that's been talking about this and trying and doing, organizing around this since, the 1970s, 1980s. And the climate justice movement, I think, was really born out of those ideas and that work. So I think there's a lot of power behind that idea, and it sort of brings together so many different movements around racial justice and economic justice and environmental justice. And I think that we're in this political moment where people are really articulating and working together, articulating the ways in which all of these social issues are deeply interconnected, and that we really can't work in silos, that in order to address them, we have to fundamentally understand and be working from that sense of interconnectedness. And therefore, that means that the leadership of people who are most directly impacted by these forces of racism, environmental racism, need to be at the forefront of those movements, that we can't see environmentalism as separate from struggles against racism, that people of color need to be at the helm of the environmental movement. And that's not the case today. There are studies that show that the majority of funding in the environmental movement goes to majority white organizations, goes to organizations that have a lot of money, and that people that are promoting social justice strategies within the environmental movement get very, very little financial support. So there's all kinds of tangible ways that that's not the case, but I think increasingly there's this understanding that that's the direction that we need to move in, and I think that that's really important, and I think a lot of young people understand that, and a lot of students understand that, and we're in this moment where we need to figure out how to remain true to those principles and not just talk about those principles, but actually put them into practice.
And how do you see that happening?
Well, it's fun. Principles have actually been written. So this is part of what I'm studying and talking about as a student in my research, is that the environmental justice movement isn't an abstract idea. People have been, doing research and having conferences and, building networks for decades. And so the answers exist. And for example, the people of color had the first National People of Color Leadership Conference, I might be getting the name wrong, in 1991, where they created a set of environmental justice principles, which was a list of, I think, 17 principles that sort of laid out exactly what is environmental justice and what does this mean. And it's very much about us having a seat at the table, that, in order for environmental justice to be something that's real, impacted communities need to have a meaningful say in what goes on in their own communities. And what does that look like if you have no political or economic power in your own community? So that's just one example. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of systems, like I was talking about. So these roadmaps already exist. There's also the Jemez principles, which came out of a conference in Jemez, New Mexico, I think. So this roadmap already exists. I think we just need to elevate the awareness that they exist, and create buy-in, and do the work, especially in places like Maine, like I said, where we're a majority white state, and so many of our organizing spaces are majority white spaces. I think it's really important that we do the hard work of talking about these principles and talking about the importance of building being in solidarity with communities of color, and what, being in solidarity with communities that are outside of our immediate community. So looking to people that are living on the front lines of fossil fuel extraction in other places in the country, and thinking about how can we build a climate justice movement in Maine that's seeking to be in solidarity with people in other places, and how do we actually build accountability to those people so that we're not just doing it in name, but that we're actually building relationships with people in other places, and being accountable to the organizing that they're already doing.
How do you see the work that you've been doing on divestment at University of Southern Maine and elsewhere connected to your studies and the principles and so on?
So that's what I'm doing my research about. I think the term climate justice is getting so much more airplay. People are using it a lot more. But I think there's a big lingering question in terms of, are people actually doing climate justice, or are they just saying climate justice? And just saying it can actually, I think it's good that people are talking about it, but it can actually be a problem. If people who already have access to power and resources are using the phrase climate justice without doing anything to substantially incorporate those principles into their work, then that's a problem, because we're stealing that language. Then, that's language that's been created by communities of color, and it's language that should continue to serve communities of color, because they've done such an amazing job of giving those words power. The reason we're using those words is because they have power. We understand they have power. So we need to make sure that that power continues to serve the people that it was intended to serve. I think that there are some, so I've been involved in the student fossil fuel divestment movement, and my awareness around these ideas has come alive during that time. So my thinking around fossil fuel divestment has evolved a lot in the time that I've been involved with it. And I think that there are some student campaigns that are doing it better than others. I think there are some student campaigns that are working really hard to actually build relationships with people on the ground, like frontline communities who are experiencing the brunt of the toxicity of the fossil fuel industry. And so I'm actually conducting interviews with student divestment activists and frontline community members around the country to sort of ask that question. Can fossil fuel divestment be a tactic for solidarity with frontline communities? And if so, what does that look like, and who gets to decide? And I'm going to be talking with students who are asking that question. A lot of students are building. One example that I know of, I haven't spoken to them yet, but I'm going to reach out to them, is students in Detroit who organized with community groups in Detroit to have toxic tours of the city of Detroit, tours of the fossil fuel refining industries in Detroit. So that's one example of how students were talking about fossil fuels, not just in the abstract atmospheric sense, but in the sense that the fossil fuel industry starts by exploiting people on the ground, and they were building relationships with people on the ground that were already organizing around that. So I think that's one example of how it can be done. And I think that there needs to be that element there in order for fossil fuel divestment to really be about climate justice. If we're only talking about carbon in the atmosphere, it can really obscure. It has this way of making it seem like, climate change is something that's going to affect everyone, and that's absolutely true, but it's not going to affect everyone in the same way. Communities of color and low-income communities are hit first and hardest, whether that's by the impacts of the fossil fuel industry or whether that's by climate change itself. So we need to really be careful about having conversations that sort of lump all of humanity into one homogenous lump of, the we who are, going to be impacted by carbon in the atmosphere. We need to have a much more nuanced conversation about who is impacted first and why.